Sega had an incredible year in 1994. It launched its brand spanking new Model 2 arcade platform worldwide, and already had a number of hits under its banner. Daytona USA was proving to be a phenomenon in every arcade it dropped into, selling incredibly well for Sega and kicking off a mini renaissance for the crumbling arcades of the West. Sega also released a Model 2 arcade version of Virtua Cop in 1994, showing that it just wasn't racing games that could be done well with 3D polygons. 1994 came to a close with the release of the much anticipated fighting sequel, Virtua Fighter 2. Again, Sega had a hit on its hands, particularly in Japan, where thousands of arcade cabinets were sold across the island nation. 1994 had shown Sega and its talented developers that arcade fans were ravenous for the new technology, so Sega set forth to make 1995 just as prolific. And man, did they ever start with a bang in February with the release of Sega Rally Championship. So excited was I to learn this was out, I drove for hours just to find one. In this episode, we will be looking at Sega Rally and its home ports and talk about why this game was so special. I hope you guys enjoy Arcade Spotlight, Sega Rally Championship. When Sega Rally first released in the arcade, it was on a slightly modified board known as the Model 2A CRX. This board was mainly an upgrade to the sound system of the original Model 2 platform. Sega AM3 had been behind the development of Sega Rally, and they were not intent on simply copying Daytona USA's success with a similar effort. They wanted to mix things up a bit, and that they did. AM3 wanted to change the way a racing game felt in the arcade. They wanted to give you multiple surfaces to race on, each with its own distinctive gameplay types. If you were on asphalt, you would get a nice tight grip that was easy to control. If you were on sand or dirt, your wheels would spin wildly, and you'd need to compensate for it on every turn. They also wanted the physics system to be something special. Gone would be the days of simply launching perfectly over jumps and hitting uneven surfaces with no effect. Sega Rally added an incredibly realistic suspension system that acted as it should with every change in the road. Momentum was also calculated far more accurately than racing games before it. You didn't just have to worry about going forward here, you needed to worry about the forces acting on the sides of the vehicles as well. Hit that jump wrong and you were careening sideways into the wall. AM3 also gave Sega Rally a rearview mirror, something entirely missing from Daytona USA. This allowed you a much more accurate ability to impede your rivals as they attempted to pass you, particularly if you had made a mistake and they were riding up on you for the kill. Needless to say, jumping from a Daytona USA cabinet to a Sega Rally cabinet in the arcade was a radically different experience. They felt nothing alike, and that's exactly how AM3 had wanted it. Another area that Daytona USA had been a trendsetter was its incredible visuals. AM3 was again in the position of doing something different here, and thanks to its rally racing foundation, they were able to give us a much more organic presentation. Gone are the urban speedways and city streets of Daytona, replaced now with the sandy twists and turns of a desert, the mud and dirt of a forest, and the ups and downs of a mountain road. This allowed AM3 to really mix up the surface types and scenery, and ultimately the atmosphere of the game. As good as Daytona USA had looked and felt visually, Sega Rally was entirely its own thing, and that was a big part of its appeal. AM3 also decided that the musical score to Sega Rally should be different. They employed the great Takenobu Mitsuyoshi, who is the extremely chipper dude belting out those great Daytona tunes you know and love. While Sega Rally kept the vocals to a minimum, it still had a great feel all its own. It was a fusion of many different styles, and though the crazy vocals of Daytona are more memorable, you still recognize every single track here. The arcade version of Sega Rally was comprised of 3 main tracks to race. A bonus track you could access should you place number 1 in those first 3, and 3 cars to choose from. The first track was the Desert Course, a laid-back run with a few jumps and a long sharp turn at the end. This is the introductory track and meant to get you acclimated to the gameplay. The sand and jumps give you a good idea of where the rest of the game plans to take you, and the musical selection is easygoing and memorable. There's a helicopter to greet you at the finish line, and you even get a bit of wildlife scenery to add a bit of authenticity to the location.
Easy left, easy right. Very long, easy right, maybe.
The forest track is perhaps my favorite track in the game. It's a mix of grass, mud, and asphalt, and has a nice middling challenge that includes areas where you can ride smooth and a handful of sharp turns to challenge you. You'll slide and spin here a lot more than the previous track, and there is a ton of room for error if you are overconfident. It's a great overall track to practice on if you need to improve your skills. Beware of the hairpin near the end. It can take a flawless run and turn it into disaster in an instant.
Checkpoint. Medium left. Medium left, maybe. Long medium right. Caution, hairpin right, checkpoint. Okay, left. Medium right. Easy right, easy left. Long medium right. Easy right.
The mountain track is an incredibly challenging area, particularly in the arcade. Here you will be racing on asphalt, so you stay nice and grippy most of the time. The challenge comes from the narrow roads and tight turns that cover much of its design. It's really easy to smack the sides of the track, which of course adds time to your run. There are a few turns that must be navigated to near perfection as well, including a nasty hairpin near the beginning of the track. The key here is your position going into each and every turn. There is little room for any corrections, so you go in perfect to start, or your ass will be tasting that wall again and again.
Checkpoint. Easy left. Easy left, maybe. Medium left. Wow. Medium right, checkpoint. Easy left, maybe. Easy left, maybe. Long medium right. Caution, K left. Easy left. Finish!
The fourth and final track is Lakeside, which is quite literally beside a lake for the final leg of the track. This is another narrow one, but now you get the added challenge of racing in mud. If you get here, your skills are decent enough to begin with, but to finish number 1 before the timer expires, you will need to be at your very best. Let off the intensity even for a second, and I guarantee you'll be looking at the title screen in short order. This is a game that you can fail even if you run well and are in first place. It is not easy.
Medium right. Wow. Over jump. Medium left. Medium right, maybe.
Sega was so happy with the arcade version, they got Sega CS to start on a Saturn version right away. Yu Suzuki and AM2 had not yet finished Sega's new graphics libraries for the Saturn, so the Saturn port needed to be built from the ground up for the hardware. This meant that little from the arcade could be reused besides some design elements, and under guidance from AM3, the end result was astonishing. The Saturn version of Daytona USA had been released a mere 8 months before Sega Rally, yet the two games almost looked like they came from different systems. Sega Rally was smoother, had better textures, had less polygon draw-in, and even featured a 2-player split-screen mode. But as good as Sega Rally's visual prowess had been on the Saturn, it was the transition of the arcade's gameplay, fully intact here, that had been so impressive. Sega Rally Saturn played like Sega Rally should. The variation in track surfaces carried over perfectly, as did its excellent physics engine. It didn't have the force feedback or movement of the deluxe arcade version, but when it came to how the game should play, the Saturn version nailed everything else. Not everything was perfect, however. In order to get the engine purring on Sega's complicated beast, Sega CS needed to have the arcade 60 frames per second frame rate, and lower the overall texture quality, losing the rear view mirror in the process. You won't be mistaking the two for one another for sure, but you still have to respect the Saturn for what it pulled off here so soon after the PR debacle that had been Daytona USA. The Saturn version also added some things that weren't in the arcade edition. Aside from the previously mentioned split-screen multiplayer, you also got a time attack mode, a ghost to compete against, and a newly recorded soundtrack in Red Book audio. You also get to tweak the gameplay a bit in this one. Sega also released a network multiplayer version of the game for the Saturn in late 1996, which also includes 3D control pad compatibility. It is important to note that the original US version of this game was rushed to market to make the holiday 1995 season. Both the Japanese and European versions feature additional graphics, modes, and gameplay tweaks over that initial US version. A PC version was released based on the Saturn game as well. It has the potential to run at a higher resolution and included network multiplayer right out of the box.
Long, medium, right. Caution, K left. Easy left. Finish!
In early 2006, Sega employed M2 to make a special version of Sega Rally Championship for the PlayStation 2. This version would be included as a bundled game with the newest entry into the Sega Rally franchise, Sega Rally 2006. It's a no-frills emulation of the arcade original. For all intents and purposes, it is the arcade version as it was on the Model 2. The only real problems with it are the sound effects are a bit off, and that it lacks any of the extras from the Saturn game, meaning it's arcade championship and practice only, and then you're done. I can't say I minded much back then, however. I was excited to get Sega Rally at home so close to the arcade original, and considering it was free with a brand new Sega Rally game, I was more than happy. For those of you interested in Sega Rally 2006, it's an okay entry into the series, looks decent, and plays similar to Sega Rally 2. There are a fair number of cars and tracks here as well. Outside of a couple of handheld Sega Rally entries that are completely different experiences, that's been it for the original game. Sega has reissued it very few times. There's the Saturn editions of the game, the PlayStation 2 disc, and that's pretty much it. Considering the mass worldwide success of the Sega Rally Arcade and the million-plus selling Saturn game, You'd think that Sega would have included this dynamo in its Sega Ages line for the Switch, or at least updated it like they did for Daytona USA on the Xbox 360 and PS3. Yet here we are, talking about yet another storied Sega franchise that languishes without a modern way to play it. It's even worse with Sega Rally 2, a game that has never received a perfect home port and has appeared on even fewer platforms. Like Virtua Fighter before it, Sega Rally's innovations inspired an entire generation of software to follow. The makers of other rally games like the Colin McRae and Dirt series of games spotlight Sega Rally as one of their biggest influences, and I feel that's perhaps the greatest compliment any piece of art can be paid. Later releases and series certainly added tons more content than Sega Rally ever had, but when you continue to be an influence years after the fact, you know you did something right. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.
Sega Rally Championship.